This was one of the wildest things I've seen in any sport, not just watching MMA. As Aaron Pico's corner was trying to get his shoulder popped back into place last night during Bellator 286. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer. If you're new here and enjoy learning about sports medicine and sort of the anatomy of different sports injuries, then please be sure and subscribe to my channels to stay up to date with all future videos. These scenes were unbelievable last night, and I think everybody recognized just how wild of a moment this was. Of course, Aaron Pico's shoulder was dislocated, and his corner here is trying to reduce it back into place. And I understand, I got to give Pico credit. I mean, he is mad tough. I've dislocated my shoulder a couple of times, and this is extremely painful. So extreme credit to try to want to get back out there. But if you attempt to reduce a joint in an incorrect way and in such sort of a violent manner, while your intent is good, you can actually do some pretty significant harm to that individual's joint. This was after that whole sequence, and the telltale sign here of the dislocated shoulder is this flattening that we see in the contour of Pico's left shoulder. So if you look at his right shoulder, everything's nice and round, nice and curved there, that contour of the deltoid muscle. But here on the left side, it's just flat. You get this abrupt flattening, suggesting that the shoulder is almost always anteriorly dislocated or popped forward out of that joint of the shoulder. When the doc got out here, I don't know where he was that whole time. We saw the attempts at the reduction, but the fight was waved off because they were actually worried he might have broken his collarbone. Thankfully, the reports at the x-rays did not show a fracture. This was just a dislocation of the shoulder. So let's walk through this whole sequence, learn more about the anatomy and kind of the proper way to do this. With our biodigital anatomy tool here, we're looking at a left shoulder, and the true shoulder joint, you can almost think of it more of like a golf ball sitting on a tee. It's the joint between the humerus of the arm bone and the glenoid, which is the socket sitting on the scapula. Now, around the glenoid, there's this rim of cartilage called the labrum. It sort of helps to deepen the socket, keep everything in proper position. We classify shoulder dislocations based on the position of that ball relative to the socket. So if the ball is forward, we call that an anterior dislocation. If it's backward, we call that posterior. Far and away more common to have an anterior shoulder dislocation, which is what it looks like Pico sustained. So in between rounds here, imagine that the ball of his humerus is forward relative to this socket, right? So essentially what we're trying to do is maneuver the arm in a way to get it to pop backwards. The biggest thing right away is that we want to do this in a slow, controlled manner, right? So these quick, aggressive, sudden tugs aren't going to be successful, mainly because it's going to cause the athlete to quickly kind of guard and tension up their muscles and make it harder to get back in place. So part one of this is that it should always be kind of a slow, very deliberate, very intentional movements rather than just big kind of sudden yanks on the arm. This part of what he's doing is sort of the right idea in the sense that we want to apply traction. So traction means that we pull the joint to try to elongate it from its position in order to get that ball of the humerus to kind of release from where it's stuck in front. We pull the arm a little bit, that tries to release it from its position in front of the glenoid, and then we twist the arm in a certain way to get it to go backwards. Now, what you're really trying to do with any joint dislocation when you reduce it is almost recreate the dislocated position because that makes it easiest for the joint to pop back in. Sometimes just traction in and of itself is enough, but oftentimes you have to apply usually some external rotation to help it get back into position. This maneuver, just raising the arm straight up, again, if you had done this with some traction beforehand, so pull the arm into traction and then gradually raise it up, is one specific technique that can be employed. But then having it up like this and just pushing backwards is only going to accentuate that force pushing the humerus forward relative to the socket. There's a bunch of techniques for shoulder reduction, some that you can even do on your own if absolutely necessary. But the one that I like to go to is called the Cunningham Technique. You basically sit, have the athlete put their injured arm up on your shoulder. You pull down on the elbow to, again, cause a little bit of traction. You externally rotate the shoulder to, again, exacerbate that dislocated position. And then you usually have the athlete stand up sort of abruptly. And so what that does is you lengthen the joint to put some tension on, massage the shoulder to relax some of the muscles, externally rotate, and then as they stand back up, hopefully it pops back into place. But there's a lot of different techniques that can be used, and you'll see different physicians use different techniques just based on what they're most comfortable with. It's important to reduce it the right way because there's a lot of surrounding structures, particularly nerves and blood vessels, that can become injured not only when you dislocate a joint, but if you try to attempt reduction in sort of an ineffective way. The most common nerve that we worry about with a shoulder dislocation is called the axillary nerve. It kind of runs closely up behind the neck of the arm bone or the neck of the humerus, and it's going to control some muscular functions of the arm. It's going to help control some sensation. but because of its close proximity to where that ball can sort of shift forward, axillary nerve injury is a concern when somebody dislocates their shoulder. So you imagine if the shoulder is popped out, maybe there is some nerve injury, and you just go yanking around aggressively on the arm, you could potentially make that nerve injury worse. Also, if there's a fracture around here, like maybe a collarbone fracture or a fracture of the ball or the socket from the dislocation, depending on where you're putting your hands and applying pressure, you might make one of those fractures worse. I'm sure in this whole sequence, if the doctor comes out, number one, the doctor's not going to attempt to reduce it. They're going to call the fight off. So really the only option is for the fighter or the corner to do it. So I understand they want their guy to continue. Obviously, Pico wants to continue fighting for just his livelihood, but it's important to understand the risks of these things when you're doing it. Honestly, I would not recommend anybody attempt a shoulder reduction in a combat sport who's not trained to properly do it because of the implications of what might happen. If the fighter attempts to do this or the corner pulls on it once or twice in a proper way and it doesn't go back in, then absolutely the fight should be called off. And the question of if it does go back in, should it continue, is really a lot of other nuances that would, I think, depend mainly on the athlete's history and if they had any other symptoms because of the dislocation. Don't be all outraged, mad at his coach here in the corner, because I think his intentions are good, and this is not something I would expect people to realize when they're trying to put a shoulder back in. They want to be helpful. They want to get their fighter back out there. So what this video should hopefully do is just teach people, give you some awareness about the possible risks, and maybe make people question if they're going to attempt to reduce a shoulder, especially in a combat sport, if they don't really understand the proper ways to do it. That's it for the video, everybody. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below. And until next time, we'll see you later.